There are phone calls that haunt the people who receive them. Calls that echo in the minds of emergency dispatchers long after their shifts end, long after they've gone home to their own families, long after they've tried to forget. The call that came through on May 22, 2013 at approximately 9:17 in the morning was one of those calls. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Gabriel Fernandez. She was crying, frantic, her words tumbling over each other in a panic that seemed almost theatrical to the dispatcher who had heard thousands of emergency calls before. Pearl was screaming that her son, her 8-year-old son Gabriel, had fallen and hit his head. He wasn't breathing. He wasn't moving. She needed help right away. The dispatcher asked the standard questions. Is he conscious? No. Is he breathing? No. What happened? He fell. He hit his head on the floor. The dispatcher could hear something in the background, another voice, a man's voice, also claiming the boy had simply fallen. The dispatcher began giving CPR instructions, her voice calm and measured, trying to guide Pearl through the steps that might save a child's life. But even through the phone line, even across the distance between the emergency call center and that apartment in Palmdale, California, something felt wrong. The dispatcher couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something off about the mother's panic, something rehearsed, something that didn't quite fit the situation she was describing. When the paramedics arrived at the small apartment on East Avenue Q10 in Palmdale, they weren't prepared for what they would find. These were experienced first responders, people who had seen car accidents and heart attacks, overdoses and falls, every kind of medical emergency you could imagine. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for the sight of 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez. The boy was naked, lying on the floor of a bedroom. His body was cold to the touch. He wasn't breathing. He had no pulse, but it wasn't the lack of vital signs that stopped the paramedics in their tracks. It was the condition of his body. Gabriel's face was covered in bruises, deep purple and black marks that covered nearly every inch of his skin. His eyes were swollen shut. His lips were split open. His skull appeared misshapen, as if something had caved in one side of his head. There were burns on his skin, welts, cuts, scars in various stages of healing. His body looked like it had been through a war. One of the paramedics would later testify that in all his years of emergency medicine, he had never seen anything like it. The child looked like he'd been tortured. They immediately began emergency procedures, trying desperately to revive him, to get his heart beating again, to get oxygen flowing to his brain. They intubated him, started chest compressions, loaded him onto a gurney and rushed him to the ambulance. As they worked, they couldn't help but notice the apartment around them. It was cluttered, dirty, filled with the detritus of a chaotic household. And standing in the doorway, watching them work, were Gabriel Fernandez and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre. Pearl was still crying, still insisting that Gabriel had simply fallen and hit his head. Isauro stood silent, his face unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest. Neither of them seemed particularly concerned about getting in the ambulance with their dying son. Neither of them asked if he would be okay. They just watched, detached, as if observing something happening to someone else's child. The paramedics rushed Gabriel to Antelope Valley Hospital, but his injuries were so severe that he was immediately transferred to Children's Hospital Los Angeles. The doctors there performed every life-saving procedure they knew, but it was already too late. Gabriel's brain had suffered catastrophic damage. The swelling was so severe that it had crushed the delicate tissue inside his skull. He was, for all intents and purposes, already gone. On May 24, 2013, 2 days after that frantic 911 call, 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez was declared brain dead. His life support was disconnected. He died surrounded not by the mother who had called 911, not by the boyfriend who had stood silently in the doorway, but by medical staff who had tried everything to save a child they'd never met before. But Gabriel's death wasn't the end of the story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. Because as investigators began to piece together what had happened in that Palmdale apartment, As they interviewed witnesses and examined evidence and spoke to Gabriel's siblings, a horrifying picture began to emerge. This wasn't a tragic accident. This wasn't a boy who had simply fallen and hit his head. This was murder. Systematic, prolonged, unspeakably cruel murder. And the man who would ultimately be held most responsible for Gabriel's death, the man who had stood silently in that doorway as paramedics fought to save the boy's life, was Isauro Aguirre. To understand how Gabriel Fernandez ended up dead on a bedroom floor at age 8, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand who Gabriel was, where he came from, and how he ended up in the care of two people who would torture him to death. Gabriel Fernando Fernandez was born on February 20, 2005, in Palmdale, California. His mother was Pearl Fernandez, a woman who had already given birth to several children and had proven incapable of caring for any of them. Pearl's life had been marked by chaos from the very beginning. Her father had been in and out of prison throughout her childhood. She had started using methamphetamine at the age of 9 years old, introduced to the drug by people who should have been protecting her. Pearl had dropped out of school in the 8th grade. She had experienced traumas that would shape the rest of her life, alleged incidents of SA that she never received counseling for, never processed, never healed from. By the time Gabriel was born, Pearl was already a deeply damaged woman, incapable of providing the kind of stable, loving environment that children need to thrive. 3 days after Gabriel was born, Pearl made a decision. She couldn't take care of this baby. She didn't want to take care of this baby. So she gave him to her uncle, Michael Lemos Carranza, and his partner, David Martinez. It was, perhaps, the best decision Pearl ever made for Gabriel, even if her motivations were entirely selfish. Michael and David welcomed baby Gabriel into their home with open arms. They fed him, changed him, stayed up with him through sleepless nights. They watched him take his first steps, heard his first words. They enrolled him in preschool and helped him with his homework. They took him to the park and the beach, celebrated his birthdays, read him bedtime stories. For the first 4 years of Gabriel's life, he was loved. He was safe. He was happy. Michael would later describe those years as some of the best of his life. Gabriel was a sweet child, always smiling, always curious about the world around him. He loved to play, loved to laugh, loved to give hugs. Michael and David weren't just raising Gabriel, they were building a family. But in 2009, when Gabriel was 4 years old, something happened that would change everything. Gabriel's grandfather, Pearl's father, Robert Fernandez, intervened. The exact details of what happened are somewhat murky, lost in conflicting accounts and fading memories, but the end result was clear. Robert believed that Gabriel should be with blood family, not with Michael and David. There are suggestions that homophobia played a role in this decision. Michael and David were a same-sex couple, and Robert may have had issues with his grandson being raised by two men. Whatever his reasoning, Robert took custody of Gabriel away from Michael and David and placed him with Gabriel's grandmother. Michael was devastated. He had raised Gabriel from infancy. Gabriel called him uncle and considered him family. To have the child ripped away so suddenly, with no warning, no preparation, felt like having his heart torn out. He tried to maintain contact with Gabriel, tried to be part of his life, but it wasn't the same. Gabriel lived with his grandmother for a while, and by all accounts, she took good care of him. But she was getting older, and raising an active young boy was physically demanding. The situation wasn't sustainable long-term. And then, in October 2012, Pearl Fernandez made another decision. She wanted Gabriel back. It wasn't because Pearl had suddenly developed maternal instincts. It wasn't because she had gotten clean, gotten her life together, become capable of caring for a child. Pearl wanted Gabriel back for one simple, sickening reason: money. In California, families receive welfare payments for each child in their care. More children meant more money. Pearl already had several of Gabriel's siblings living with her. Adding Gabriel to the household would mean additional income. It was a purely financial calculation, a transaction that treated a human child as nothing more than a source of revenue. Gabriel's grandfather, despite his earlier intervention to take the boy away from Michael and David, agreed to let Pearl take custody. Maybe he believed Pearl had changed. Maybe he thought a child should be with his mother. Maybe he just didn't want the responsibility anymore. Whatever his reasoning, in October 2012, 7-year-old Gabriel Fernandez moved in with his mother Pearl and her boyfriend Isauro Aguirre. It was a death sentence, though nobody knew it yet. To understand what happened to Gabriel in that apartment, we need to understand the man who would become his primary tormentor. We need to understand Isauro Aguirre. Isauro Aguirre was born on June 13, 1980. He grew up in the Palmdale area, a sprawling desert city in northern Los Angeles County. His childhood was unremarkable in most ways, neither particularly privileged nor particularly deprived. He attended local schools but struggled academically. He repeated grades multiple times before eventually dropping out altogether. As an adult, Isauro worked at the Woodland Park Retirement Hotel in Woodland Hills, California, where he was employed as a caregiver for elderly residents. This detail is particularly chilling when you consider what he would later do to Gabriel. The people who knew Isauro during this time described him as kind and gentle, someone who seemed to genuinely care about the elderly people he looked after. His former employer would later express complete shock at what Isauro was accused of doing. The man she knew, the man who had worked for her, had shown patience and compassion. He had been good at his job. There had been no warning signs, no red flags, nothing to suggest he was capable of the monstrous cruelty he would later inflict on a child. But people are complicated. People can show kindness to some and cruelty to others. And when Isauro Aguirre met Pearl Fernandez, something in him changed, or perhaps something in him was unleashed, something that had always been there, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Isauro and Pearl's relationship was toxic from the start. Both had struggled with substance abuse. Both had anger issues. Both had a tendency toward violence. When they moved in together, they created a household environment that was chaotic, unstable, and dangerous. Pearl already had several children from previous relationships, Gabriel's half-siblings. These children lived in the apartment with Pearl and Isauro, witnessing daily the dysfunction and violence that characterized their home life. And in October 2012, Gabriel joined them. At first, things seemed okay. Gabriel was enrolled at Summerwind Elementary School, where he was placed in the 3rd grade. His teacher was a woman named Jennifer Garcia, a dedicated educator who genuinely cared about her students. Gabriel seemed like a normal kid, maybe a little quiet, a little reserved, but otherwise unremarkable. The first few weeks passed without incident. Gabriel did his schoolwork, played with other kids at recess, seemed to be adjusting to his new life. Jennifer Garcia had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong. But then slowly, things began to change. It started with questions. Gabriel would approach Ms. Garcia after class when the other students had left, and he would ask her things that made her uncomfortable. "Is it normal for your mom to hit you?" he asked one day. "Is it normal to get hit with a belt buckle until you bleed?" Ms. Garcia's blood ran cold. These weren't normal questions. These weren't the kinds of things children asked unless something was very, very wrong. She knelt down to Gabriel's eye level, looked him in the face, and asked gently if someone was hurting him at home. Gabriel's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't answer directly. He just shrugged, looked down at his shoes, and walked away. On October 30, 2012, less than a month after Gabriel had moved in with Pearl and Isauro, Jennifer Garcia made the first call to the child abuse hotline. She reported her concerns about Gabriel, about the questions he had asked, about the change she was seeing in his demeanor. A social worker named Stephanie Rodriguez was assigned to investigate. It should have been the beginning of Gabriel's rescue. Instead, it was the beginning of one of the most catastrophic failures of the child welfare system in California history. In November 2012, Gabriel showed up to school with visible injuries. There were scabs on his head. Chunks of his hair were missing, pulled out by the roots. When Ms. Garcia asked what happened, Gabriel said his mother had punched him in the face. Ms. Garcia called DCFS again, and again, and again. She would end up making more than a dozen calls to the Department of Children and Family Services, each time reporting new injuries, new concerns, new reasons to believe that Gabriel was being abused. Each time a social worker would be dispatched to investigate. Each time the social worker would visit the home, speak to Pearl and Isauro, maybe speak to Gabriel, and then close the case, concluding that there was insufficient evidence of abuse. How was this possible? How could a child show up to school repeatedly with visible injuries, with scabs and bruises and missing hair, and yet the system designed to protect him failed so completely? Part of the answer lies in the overwhelming caseloads carried by social workers in Los Angeles County. Stephanie Rodriguez and the other social workers assigned to Gabriel's case were each responsible for dozens of families, dozens of children. They were overworked, understressed, and operating in a system that prioritized keeping families together over protecting children from abuse. But it wasn't just about caseloads. There was negligence, there was incompetence, and as would later be revealed, there was outright falsification of records. Social workers would claim to have visited the home when they hadn't. They would claim to have interviewed Gabriel alone when they had only spoken to him with Pearl and Isauro present. They would minimize injuries, accept implausible explanations, and fail to follow up on obvious red flags. And while the system failed him, while the people who were supposed to protect him filed their reports and closed their cases and moved on to the next family, Gabriel Fernandez was living through hell. The abuse that Gabriel suffered at the hands of Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre defies comprehension. It wasn't occasional violence. It wasn't discipline that went too far. It wasn't punishment administered in anger and then regretted. It was systematic, prolonged, escalating torture, inflicted on a child for months, every single day, often multiple times a day. Gabriel's siblings would later testify to what they witnessed in that apartment, testimony so disturbing that even hardened prosecutors struggled to maintain their composure while listening to it. These children, some as young as 7 or 8 years old themselves, had to describe in detail the horrors they had seen inflicted on their brother. Gabriel was locked inside a small cabinet in the bedroom, a cabinet that was barely big enough to hold his small body. He would be stuffed inside with a sock shoved in his mouth to muffle his screams. The cabinet would be latched shut, and he would be left there for hours, sometimes overnight, cramped and terrified in the darkness, unable to move, unable to cry out for help. He was shot with a BB gun over and over again by both Pearl and Isauro. They would make him stand against a wall while they took turns shooting him, aiming for his face, his body, his groin. The BB pellets embedded themselves in his flesh, tiny metal spheres that would later be found during his autopsy, lodged in his lung tissue, in his groin area, permanent evidence of the torture he had endured. Gabriel was forced to eat cat feces and cat litter. When he refused, when he gagged and cried and begged not to, he was beaten until he complied. His siblings testified that they watched as Isauro would scoop cat feces from the litter box and force it into Gabriel's mouth, holding his jaw shut until he swallowed. He was fed spoiled food, rotten meat and vegetables that Pearl and Isauro wouldn't eat themselves. When Gabriel vomited from the rotten food, they would force him to eat his own vomit. They made him kneel on uncooked rice, a form of torture that sounds almost innocuous until you understand the reality of it, the way the hard grains dig into flesh, the way kneeling on them for hours causes excruciating pain, the way it leaves marks and bruises that last for days. Gabriel was pepper sprayed in the face, repeatedly. At close range, The chemical spray would burn his eyes, his nose, his throat, leaving him gasping and crying and temporarily blinded. His siblings testified that this happened multiple times, that Pearl and Isauro seemed to find it amusing, that they would laugh as Gabriel writhed in pain. He was beaten with belt buckles, the metal ends striking his skin and leaving deep welts and cuts. He was beaten with metal hangers, with a wooden club, with a bat. The beatings were so severe, so frequent, that Gabriel's body became a map of injuries in various stages of healing. Fresh bruises overlapped with fatting ones. New cuts crossed old scars. Isauro knocked out Gabriel's teeth with a bat, just swung it at the boy's face and knocked his teeth out, leaving him bleeding and crying on the floor. Gabriel's siblings watched it happen. They watched a lot of things happen that no child should ever have to see. The psychological torture was equally horrific. Isauro and Pearl called Gabriel gay constantly. They mocked him, told him he was worthless, told him he was nothing. Isauro, in particular, seemed to have convinced himself that Gabriel was gay, and this belief fueled his rage. He forced Gabriel to wear girls' clothes to school, to dress in pink and purple, to carry a purse. He did this not as some misguided attempt at acceptance, but as humiliation, as mockery, as another form of torture. Gabriel wasn't allowed to use the bathroom. He was forced to soil himself and then beaten for doing so. His siblings testified that he would beg to be allowed to use the toilet, would cry and plead, but Pearl and Isauro would refuse. When he inevitably had an accident, they would beat him for being disgusting, for being dirty, for being less than human. He was burned with cigarettes. There were circular burn marks on his skin, the unmistakable signature of cigarette torture, inflicted deliberately, methodically, by people who seemed to enjoy his suffering. All of this was happening while Gabriel was still attending school, while Jennifer Garcia was still calling DCFS, while social workers were supposedly monitoring the situation. How did nobody see? How did nobody stop it? Some people did see. The school security guard, Isauro Martinez, noticed Gabriel's injuries. He saw the bruises, the marks, the way Gabriel flinched when someone moved too quickly near him. He reported his concerns to the administration, who reported them to DCFS. A teacher's aide noticed that Gabriel would come to school hungry, desperately hungry, and would hide food in his pockets to eat later. She noticed that he was losing weight, that his clothes hung off his thin frame, that he looked sick and weak. Other students noticed too. They would later tell investigators that Gabriel often had visible injuries, that he seemed sad and scared, that he didn't play with other kids the way he used to. But despite all these reports, despite all the calls to DCFS, despite all the evidence that something terrible was happening to this child, the system continued to fail him. Social workers visited the home and were convinced by Pearl's explanations. Gabriel is clumsy, he falls a lot. Gabriel gets into fights with his siblings. Gabriel has behavioral problems and needs discipline. In January 2013, Gabriel showed up to school with his entire face covered in bruises. Not just a bruise here or there, but his whole face, both eyes blackened, his cheeks purple, his lips split open. When Ms. Garcia asked what happened, Gabriel told her the truth. He told her that Isauro had shot him in the face with a BB gun. Ms. Garcia called DCFS immediately. A social worker came out, investigated, spoke to Pearl and Isauro, and once again concluded that there was insufficient evidence to remove Gabriel from the home. The case was closed. How is this possible? How could a child show up to school with a face covered in bruises, report being shot with a BB gun, and yet remain in the home with his abusers? The social workers assigned to Gabriel's case would later be charged with felony child abuse and falsifying public records. The investigation would reveal that they had repeatedly lied in their reports, had failed to properly investigate, had essentially rubber-stamped the case without doing the work necessary to determine if Gabriel was safe. Stephanie Rodriguez, Patricia Clement, and their supervisors Kevin Baum and Gregory Merritt all faced criminal charges for their role in Gabriel's death. They had the power to save him. They had the authority to remove him from that home. They chose not to, and Gabriel paid the price. By April and May of 2013, Gabriel's final weeks of life, the abuse had reached a crescendo of cruelty that is almost impossible to fathom. He was no longer attending school regularly. When he did show up, he could barely walk, could barely function. He was weak, sick, covered in injuries that were impossible to hide. Gabriel's siblings would later testify that during this time, Isauro's hatred for Gabriel seemed to intensify. The abuse became even more frequent, even more severe. Gabriel was beaten daily, sometimes multiple times a day. He was kept in the cabinet for longer periods. He was denied food, water, the ability to use the bathroom. Isauro seemed to enjoy torturing Gabriel. He would laugh while inflicting pain, would mock the boy while he cried, would seem energized by Gabriel's suffering. Pearl, for her part, participated fully in the abuse, sometimes taking the lead, sometimes egging Isauro on, always complicit, always cruel. The other children in the house lived in terror. They knew that if they tried to help Gabriel, if they intervened, if they told anyone what was happening, they would be next. So they watched, helpless and traumatized, as their brother was slowly tortured to death. May 22, 2013, started like many other days in the Palmdale apartment. Gabriel was in pain, weak, barely able to stand. Isauro and Pearl were angry, as they often were, looking for any excuse to punish the boy they had decided to hate. The excuse that day was toys. Gabriel's siblings had left toys on the floor, had failed to clean up properly, but it was Gabriel who would pay the price. Pearl dragged Gabriel into the bedroom. Isauro followed. The other children heard screaming, the sound of blows landing, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor again and again and again. And then, after what felt like an eternity, silence. When the door opened, Gabriel was unconscious. His head was misshapen, caved in on one side. He wasn't breathing. He had no pulse. He was dying, possibly already dead, his 8-year-old body finally giving up after months of torture that no human being should ever have to endure. Pearl called 911, frantic, claiming Gabriel had fallen and hit his head. Isauro stood in the background, silent, watching. Neither of them attempted CPR. Neither of them seemed particularly concerned. They had finally gone too far, finally crossed the line from torture to murder, and now they were trying to cover their tracks. But there was no covering this up. Gabriel's injuries were too severe, too extensive, too obviously the result of prolonged abuse. The paramedics knew immediately that this was no accident. The doctors at the hospital knew. The police knew. Within hours of Gabriel's arrival at the hospital, Gabriel Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were both arrested and charged with murder. When doctors at Children's Hospital Los Angeles examined Gabriel's body, they found a catalog of injuries so extensive that it took hours to document them all. Dr. Alyssa Rake, a forensic pediatrician, conducted the examination and would later testify in court about what she found. Gabriel had a depressed skull fracture on the left side of his head, a massive injury consistent with being struck repeatedly with a blunt object. The fracture had caused bleeding in his brain, massive swelling, and ultimately brain death. His skull was broken in multiple places. He had 3 broken ribs, injuries that were several weeks old based on the healing patterns. This meant Gabriel had been walking around, going to school, living his life with broken ribs, in constant pain, with no medical treatment. He was missing several teeth, knocked out by Isauro's bat. His mouth was full of cuts and scars. There were BB pellets embedded in his lung and groin, permanent reminders of the times he had been used as target practice. The pellet in his lung had punctured the tissue, causing internal damage that his body had tried to heal even as new injuries were being inflicted. There was a deep laceration at the base of his penis, an injury so horrific that prosecutors struggled to even describe it in court. The purpose of this injury, how it was inflicted, remains unclear, but it speaks to the level of sadistic cruelty Gabriel endured. His body was covered in bruises in various stages of healing. Yellowing bruises from weeks ago overlapping with fresh purple-black marks from the final beating. There were bruises on his face, his torso, his arms, his legs, his back. There were cigarette burns, scars from previous cuts, marks from being struck with belt buckles and hangers. Gabriel was severely malnourished, his body weight far below what it should have been for a healthy 8-year-old. His liver showed signs of damage. His body had been shutting down, slowly dying even before the final beating that killed him. Dr. Rake testified that in her years of examining child abuse victims, she had never seen anything as severe as what had been done to Gabriel Fernandez. The level of torture, the extent of the injuries, the prolonged nature of the abuse, all of it pointed to something beyond even the worst cases she had previously encountered. On May 24, 2013, Gabriel was declared brain dead. His life support was disconnected. 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez was pronounced dead, his brief life ended by the very people who were supposed to love and protect him. The investigation into Gabriel's death moved quickly. Detectives interviewed Gabriel's siblings, who provided heartbreaking, detailed accounts of the abuse they had witnessed. They interviewed teachers, school staff, neighbors, anyone who had come into contact with the family. They searched the apartment and found evidence everywhere. The cabinet where Gabriel had been locked was too small for a child his size, the interior scratched as if he had tried to claw his way out. There was a blood-stained bat, the weapon that had knocked out Gabriel's teeth and likely contributed to his skull fracture. There was the BB gun that had been used to shoot him. There were pepper spray canisters, belt buckles with Gabriel's blood on them, all the implements of torture that had been used against a helpless child. Investigators also discovered that Pearl had been forging doctor's notes to explain Gabriel's absences from school. She had created fake medical documents claiming Gabriel had appointments, was sick, needed to stay home. She was trying to keep him away from the people who might notice his injuries, might ask questions, might intervene. The Los Angeles County Grand Jury heard evidence in Gabriel's case and issued an 800-page report detailing the abuse and the systematic failures that had allowed it to continue. The report was so disturbing that portions of it were kept sealed to protect the privacy of Gabriel's siblings and to spare the public some of the most graphic details. Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were both charged with capital murder with a special circumstance of torture. In California, this meant they were eligible for the death penalty. The prosecutor assigned to the case was Jonathan Hatami, a deputy district attorney who had handled child abuse cases before but had never seen anything like what had been done to Gabriel. Hatami would later say that Gabriel's case changed him, that it made him question his faith in humanity, that it haunted his dreams. But it also made him determined to seek justice, to make sure that Pearl and Isauro paid the full price for what they had done. In September 2017, more than 4 years after Gabriel's death, the trial of Isauro Aguirre began. Pearl had already agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder and accept a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, likely to avoid the death penalty. But Isauro went to trial, his attorney arguing that while he had abused Gabriel, he hadn't intended to kill him, that Gabriel's death was the result of rage rather than premeditation. The prosecution had a different story to tell. They argued that Isauro Aguirre had systematically tortured Gabriel for months, that he had enjoyed inflicting pain on the boy, that the torture escalated over time in both frequency and severity. This wasn't rage, this was sadism. This wasn't an accident, this was murder. The trial lasted several weeks, and the evidence presented was so disturbing that jurors were seen crying, gasping, covering their faces. Photos of Gabriel's body were shown, images so graphic that even hardened court reporters had to look away. Gabriel's siblings testified, these young children having to relive the trauma of watching their brother being tortured to death. Jennifer Garcia, Gabriel's teacher, testified about the repeated calls she had made to DCFS, the injuries she had seen, the questions Gabriel had asked. She cried on the stand, clearly devastated that despite her best efforts, she had been unable to save him. Arturo Martinez, the school security guard, testified about Gabriel's injuries and his own reports to authorities. Medical examiners testified about the extensive injuries found on Gabriel's body, explaining to the jury exactly what each injury meant, how it had been inflicted, how much pain Gabriel would have been in. Dr. Rake's testimony was particularly powerful, her professional demeanor cracking at times as she described what had been done to this child. The defense attorney, Michael Sklar, tried to argue that Isauro had acted in rage, that he had anger management issues, that he had not intended to kill Gabriel. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. The months of systematic abuse, the torture, the escalating violence, all of it pointed to someone who knew exactly what he was doing and enjoyed doing it. Prosecutor Jonathan Hatami argued that Isauro Aguirre had hated Gabriel because he believed the boy was gay, that this homophobia had fueled the abuse, that Isauro had liked torturing Gabriel. The evidence supported this theory. The forcing Gabriel to wear girls' clothes, the constant mocking and name-calling, the way Isauro seemed to focus his rage on Gabriel while largely leaving the other children alone, all pointed to a specific, targeted hatred. On November 15, 2017, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The special circumstance of torture was also found to be true, meaning Isauro was eligible for the death penalty. The penalty phase of the trial began on November 27, 2017. This is where the jury would decide whether Isauro Aguirre should be sentenced to death or to life in prison without the possibility of parole. More witnesses testified, including Gabriel's biological father, Arnold Contreras, who had not been part of Gabriel's life but was devastated by his son's death. Gabriel's grandfather, Robert Fernandez, the man who had taken Gabriel away from Uncle Michael and placed him with Pearl, gave emotional testimony. He was clearly racked with guilt, knowing that his decision had led to Gabriel being in that apartment, in the care of the two people who would kill him. Robert cried on the stand, telling the jury about the sweet, happy little boy Gabriel had been, about the potential that had been stolen from him. On December 13, 2017, the jury returned with their recommendation. They recommended that Isauro Aguirre be sentenced to death for the torture and murder of Gabriel Fernandez. Judge George Lomley accepted the jury's recommendation and formally sentenced Aguirre to death. On June 13, 2018, Isauro Aguirre was admitted to San Quentin State Prison in California to await execution. However, in 2019, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued a moratorium on the death penalty in the state, meaning that no executions would be carried out during his tenure as governor. Aguirre remains on death row, but there is currently no execution date set. In 2021, he was transferred to Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego County, where he remains incarcerated. Pearl Fernandez pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars, never eligible for release. She is currently incarcerated at Chowchilla State Women's Prison in California. But the story doesn't end with Pearl and Isauro behind bars. There was still the question of the social workers, the people who had been tasked with protecting Gabriel and had failed so catastrophically. In March 2016, a grand jury indicted 4 Los Angeles County social workers on charges of felony child abuse and falsifying public records. Stephanie Rodriguez and Patricia Clement were the line social workers who had handled Gabriel's case. Kevin Baum and Gregory Merritt were their supervisors. All four were accused of knowing about Gabriel's abuse, of having the power to remove him from the home, and of choosing not to act. The charges against them were unprecedented. Social workers had never before been criminally charged in California for failing to protect a child in their care. The case raised complex questions about professional liability, about how much responsibility social workers should bear when a child in the system is killed. The social workers' attorneys argued that their clients were scapegoats, that the real problem was a broken system that overworked and under-resourced social workers to the point where mistakes were inevitable. They argued that charging individual social workers criminally would have a chilling effect on the profession, making it harder to recruit people to do this difficult, important work. But prosecutors argued that this wasn't about honest mistakes or a systemic failure. This was about individuals who had repeatedly falsified records, who had lied about visits they hadn't made and interviews they hadn't conducted, who had consciously chosen to ignore evidence of abuse. The charges stood. The case against the social workers wound through the courts for years. In 2020, an appeals court ruled that social workers could not be held criminally liable for decisions made in the course of their professional duties, and the charges were dismissed. The ruling was controversial, with many people arguing that it meant social workers could escape accountability even in cases of egregious negligence. The dismissal of charges against the social workers remains a point of contention. Many people, including Gabriel's family and child welfare advocates, believe that the social workers should have faced criminal consequences for their role in Gabriel's death. Others argue that the criminal justice system is not the appropriate mechanism for addressing failures in the child welfare system. Regardless of the legal outcomes, the failures in Gabriel's case led to significant reforms in Los Angeles County's Department of Children and Family Services. Caseloads were reduced, training was improved, new protocols were put in place for investigating reports of abuse. Whether these reforms will prevent another tragedy like Gabriel's remains to be seen. Gabriel's great uncle, Michael Lemos Carranza, the man who had raised Gabriel for the first 4 years of his life, was devastated by the boy's death. He blamed himself for not fighting harder to keep custody, for not finding a way to intervene when Gabriel was placed with Pearl. Michael created a Facebook page called Gabriel's Justice, where he advocated for child welfare reform and kept Gabriel's memory alive. Tragically, Michael died by suicide in 2014, a year after Gabriel's death. Those close to him said he never recovered from the guilt and grief of losing the child he had loved as a son. In 2020, Netflix released a documentary series called The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, directed by Brian Knappenberger. The 6-episode series examined Gabriel's case in detail, interviewing family members, teachers, first responders, prosecutors, and others involved in the case. The documentary brought Gabriel's story to a global audience and sparked renewed conversations about child abuse, systemic failures, and how society protects its most vulnerable members. The documentary was difficult to watch, filled with disturbing details and heartbreaking interviews. But it also served an important purpose, ensuring that Gabriel's death was not forgotten, that his suffering meant something, that changes were made so that, hopefully, other children wouldn't suffer the same fate. Several laws and initiatives have been named in Gabriel's honor. Gabriel's Law refers to various proposed reforms to child welfare systems, though specific legislation varies by jurisdiction. The focus of these reforms is typically on improving communication between agencies, reducing social worker caseloads, and ensuring that reports of abuse are properly investigated. Gabriel's family members, those who loved him and tried to protect him, remember him not as a victim but as a child. They remember his smile, his laughter, the way he loved to play and explore. They remember how he used to give the biggest hugs, how he was always curious about everything, how he had his whole life ahead of him. They remember that before the torture, before the abuse, before the system failed him, Gabriel Fernandez was just a little boy who wanted to be loved. He wanted to play with toys and go to school and have friends and grow up to be whatever he wanted to be. He deserved all of that. He deserved safety and love, and the chance to become whoever he was meant to become. Instead, Gabriel's life was cut short in the most horrific way imaginable, at the hands of people who should have protected him, while a system that should have saved him looked the other way. 8 years old. That's how old Gabriel was when he died. 8 years old, and he had already experienced more pain, more cruelty, more suffering than most people experience in a lifetime. He endured it alone, locked in a cabinet, shot with a BB gun, beaten with bats, forced to eat things that no one should ever have to consume. He endured it while going to school, while trying to learn his multiplication tables, while trying to just be a kid. And he endured it while repeatedly telling people what was happening to him. He told his teacher. He told the security guard. He showed people his injuries. He asked for help in the only ways an 8-year-old knows how. And he was failed again and again and again, until finally on May 22, 2013, the abuse killed him. Isauro Aguirre sits in a prison cell in California, serving a death sentence that may never be carried out. Gabriel Fernandez sits in a different prison, serving life without parole. The social workers who failed Gabriel have had their criminal charges dismissed and have moved on with their lives. The system that failed to protect Gabriel has implemented reforms and continues to struggle with overwhelming caseloads and insufficient resources. And Gabriel Fernandez is gone, a life full of potential snuffed out before it ever had a chance to truly begin. He will never turn 9, never go to middle school, never learn to drive, never fall in love, never have children of his own, never experience any of the joys and sorrows and ordinary moments that make up a human life. What happened to Gabriel Fernandez is a tragedy that should never have occurred. It's a failure of individuals, yes, Pearl and Isauro, who chose to torture and kill a child. But it's also a failure of systems, of the social workers and supervisors who didn't do their jobs, of the child welfare apparatus that prioritizes keeping families together over keeping children safe, of a society that underfunds and undervalues the work of protecting vulnerable children. If there's anything to be learned from Gabriel's death, it's that we must do better. We must listen when children tell us they're being hurt. We must act when we see signs of abuse. We must adequately fund and staff child welfare services. We must hold accountable those who fail to protect children in their care. We must never, ever allow another Gabriel Fernandez to suffer and die while the people and systems meant to save him fail to act. Gabriel Fernandez should be alive today. He should be 20 years old, a young man on the cusp of adulthood, figuring out who he is and who he wants to become. Instead, he's a name, a case file, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when evil meets indifference. Rest in peace, Gabriel Fernando Fernandez. You deserved so much better than the world gave you. If you or someone you know is experiencing child abuse, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. The hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and provides crisis intervention, information, and referrals to thousands of emergency, social service, and support resources. All calls are confidential. Thank you for watching this video. Gabriel's story is difficult to hear, but it's important that we don't forget him, that we honor his memory by working to protect other children from suffering the same fate. If you found this video informative, please consider sharing it to raise awareness about child abuse and the importance of systemic reforms to protect vulnerable children. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.